Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome back to another Sunday Perspectives show here on the Cloudcast. Hope you all have been enjoying these. We've been adding to the main feed, and I know we've gotten some very, very good feedback on the last couple of shows. The last couple of shows, we've really kind of done look backs. You know, what's happened. We looked at Andy Jassy's sort of history at AWS as he transitions from leading AWS to leading all of Amazon. We looked at some lessons learned from OpenStack, almost going back almost a decade, and kind of how that's impacted some of the other infrastructure projects going forward. Today, we're going to look forward in this week's Sunday Perspective. We're going to look at, what might the 2020s, this next decade, which we're already, a year or two, depending on how you count. We're in a little bit into the 2020s. Obviously, we probably aren't going to be 100% accurate looking forward that far, even if we look forward 5 years. But, sometimes it's good to sort of step back and think about, what are the things that we absolutely know, sort of apply the Jeff Bezos test of what do we know probably won't change. And then also look at, what do we expect will change? And then what are some of the big unknowns to kind of plan for or to consider, for the big 3, 4, 5 public clouds that are out there. So with that, we're going to kind of dig into those topics in today's show right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And folks, as we mentioned in the kickoff, we're going to kind of look at, kind of where we see the next, call it a decade. We may only look forward about 5 or 6 years, but that far in our industry is still pretty far in advance. But really want to look at, what are some of the things that we can expect out of the big public clouds, whether we think about it as the big 3 public clouds or, there's 5 or 6 in play, however you want to look at it, and things that may emerge over time. But we really kind of want to look at, what we can expect out of the next, decade, 5 to 10 years, things that we feel really confident in, things that are, we expect to be part of the change landscape, but we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like. And then we're going to really dive into some of the big unknowns as to what might really change the landscape. So why don't we dig into that? And let's start with sort of the Jeff Bezos test of, not predict what your business will look like in the future, but, what do we know in this industry that we feel really, really confident won't change, in the future, in the next, 5 plus years, if you will. So I think what we're going to put on that list, first and foremost, is we're going to see more and more adoption of SaaS applications, right? We're seeing this already. SaaS is already the largest segment of cloud computing, even though we talk about the big 3 all the time. SaaS is still the largest segment of cloud computing. As of 2020, it was about $120 billion. Put that in perspective, if you add up the revenues of sort of AWS, Azure, and Google, they're probably sort of more on the order of $70-80 billion in terms of their market cap. So, maybe slightly more than that, but SaaS is still probably 30 to 50% larger than than those 3 cloud providers. But keep in mind, a lot of the SaaS providers do run on top of, the big 3 or 4 cloud providers. So I think we're expecting to see more and more adoption of SaaS, which again will not only change the landscape of how people interact with applications. They'll be getting more and more out of, running a lot of their core applications, allowing those to be SaaS applications. But also, that's going to add to the amount of usage of the public cloud as those SaaS applications are run in the public cloud. The next thing, obviously, we expect to see more and more migration of applications from the data center to the public cloud. We've been seeing this happening over time. It's still somewhat of a process. I think we've seen quite a bit of low-hanging fruit move to the cloud. We're beginning to see more and more technologies made available, whether these are services that come from your SIs and sort of integration partners that are helping to do this en masse. We're seeing tooling that helps this en masse. We're seeing more and more of some of the applications and the services that you expected to see in your data center become native cloud services, if you will. So more and more migrations into the public cloud. I think we'll continue to see the growth of the 3 or 4, 5 big public clouds, grow. Right now, they're somewhere south of $100 billion. It wouldn't be unusual to see that become probably closer to a $300 billion sort of number by the time we exit the next decade, if not maybe even slightly higher than that. So wouldn't be unusual to see that kind of growth. I think the third thing that we're going to see that we can pretty much guarantee is that we're going to see huge CAPEX spending by the big 3, big 4, but especially the ones who are not just in the technology business, right? Who also have major other businesses that they're supporting. So Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. For a couple of reasons, I think we can feel very confident in this. At least in the near term, we're probably going to see lower interest rates kind of across the globe as we're all trying to recover from the pandemic. We're seeing incredibly low interest rates, so they're able to get capital very, very cheap. They're able to make very, very big long-term investments. So not only are they trying to grow their cloud business, i.e., buying a lot of servers, expanding into new data centers, new regions, edge regions, sort of near edge, far edge regions, and so forth. But also they're making huge capital investments for the other parts of their business, right? We're seeing all of them, or many of them, trying to get into other more vertical businesses. So whether those are healthcare or things around autonomous driving or transportation, delivery services, gaming services, AR and VR services, financial services, things that are, huge spending areas in the overall economy, but also things that take up, enormous amount of computing power, but also, where things like locality of real estate is really important. So, we're going to continue to see huge CAPEX spending from these companies to support both, their expansion of cloud computing resources, but also, this expansion of other types of businesses that we're seeing them either dabble in, partner in, or directly get involved in. I think the next thing that we can feel very confident is we're going to see more and more rapid adoption of ARM technologies. And, obviously we've seen this happen in the mobile space. We've seen this happen now in laptops. We're seeing it become more of a thing in the public cloud, across the board. And that does a couple of things. Number one, at the most basic level, it's proven to bring down computing costs, right? In some cases, 30, 40, 50%, right? So, and I expect that we're going to see, because of the way the cloud providers work with their chip partners and so forth, they're able to flip their environments. They're able to have more latest technology than oftentimes the enterprises do or mid-market companies do. And so, when you have those sort of economic differences between maybe what goes on in your data center and what goes on in the public cloud, especially at that level, you're going to see more and more not only migration to the cloud, but adoption of those ARM technologies. Those things will then trickle down into storage and other types of things. So we'll see some pretty significant kind of overall cost savings that'll drive out of that. And then the last thing I think we can feel really comfortable in, this is both sort of we know that this will happen, but we're not exactly sure how it will happen. Edge computing is going to become a much bigger thing. Obviously, we're seeing computing pushed out into all sorts of locations. The normal evolution in our industry is we consolidate and centralize, and then we distribute, and then at some point we go back and consolidate and centralize, then we go back and distribute. We've been consolidating and centralizing around the big public clouds now for nearly a decade, but we're going to see this expansion distribution happen out to the edge. So I think we feel very confident that that's going to happen. We're already seeing that happen. But there's also a lot of evolution that has to happen in the edge, and we'll talk about that more in the sort of other trends and unknowns. But the footprint, what exactly it's going to look like. How do you do management updates to thousands and thousands of devices that have limited network bandwidth in a lot of cases, or in far-flung places? How do you do it without truck rolls? How do you do security for these devices? You want them to just be plug and play, but you also want them to be secure. Lots and lots of evolution and lots of unknowns that go on there. We'll obviously see innovation in that space come along, but definitely an area that we know will expand. We know there'll be a lot of energy placed there, a lot of investment placed there, but exactly what it's going to look like is still very unknown, partially because there are so many definitions of edge, and we'll talk about that a little more in trends. So those are the things we know that are going to happen, right? We can feel really, really confident that you can you can sort of bet that those things are going to happen. You can optimize around those types of things. Now, what are some of the trends that we've been seeing the beginnings of here in the early 2020s that we expect to see expanding out quite a bit in the rest of the 2020s, or at least the next 4 or 5 years and so forth? I think the one of them is, we are beginning to see this strange sort of dance happening between telcos and the cloud providers. The telcos are in an interesting position in that they've always been able to own their facilities. They've sort of, horizontally and vertically integrated what they do. They own, last mile to the customer's location. They own devices that people use. They own the backhaul of what they do. But we're beginning to see them, get into interesting relationships with the cloud providers. And again, as you get into edge computing, as you get into these sort of interesting scenarios of like, do I work with a cloud provider? Do I work with a telco? What's the blending between those things? So we're going to see some interesting partnerships happen there. I think we'll see some work really well. We'll see some copycat stuff that happens, and then we'll also see some that probably fail terribly, as we've always seen in our industry, where some people are very good at partnerships and some are very bad at them, and then we'll see the obvious sort of hey, we'll partner. No, we'll pull back and do it ourselves. We'll partner. We'll pull back and do it ourselves. So, the telcos are going through some interesting transitions in terms of, they move from being very hardware centric and, long-term commitments to their vendors to trying to adopt software and open source more and more. That's really changed the dynamics of how they work with their vendors, but also the skill sets that they have to have in-house, or they're not just writing these planning documents, they're actually having to maybe get involved with writing code. And now we're seeing these interesting partnerships start to evolve, which, may or may not be successful, but we're seeing them, that evolution happen. The second thing we have that we're beginning to see is more and more what I'll call sort of second and third generations of cloud native applications being built, and then the building blocks of those sort of following through. So if you follow the show for a while, you know that we've highlighted things like Snowflake Computing, or Snowflake DB, I guess, if you will, as being one of these types of companies, right? Like built only to run in the public cloud, designed to be somewhat cloud agnostic, so you can get the same service in every single cloud. But also we're beginning to see sort of second order effects where their ecosystem is beginning to build on top of them. So we're, they're saying, hey, the Snowflake layer is solved a bunch of problems for us. We're going to build on top of that. And so we're going to start to see more and more cloud native foundational companies that do these things. We're going to see them be very data centric, and then we'll begin to see ecosystems build on top of them with sort of unique domain specific applications that are going to help either certain industries or certain parts of IT and so forth. The next thing we see, and this is sort of similar to that, but it's a little bit different, is we're beginning to see more and more of vendors partnering with the big three, right? So these are, in a lot of cases, like they began as an open source project. A company commercialized that open source project, and more we're seeing companies, end user customers, if you will, using cloud computing, but they want the advantage of sort of the advanced features and functionality that these commercialized offerings have. And so we've seen this with, MongoDB, we've seen this with Confluent, we've seen this with Databricks, we've seen this with like Red Hat OpenShift, we've seen this with a bunch of different things. We've seen this with VMware, where they're working not just to deliver themselves as a SaaS service, but to work with the cloud providers that now become cloud native. And I think the cloud providers are starting to look at that and they're going, okay, we can offer just an open source version, but also we can offer something that's more advanced, and we get the benefit of it running in our cloud. Our customers want to be in our cloud, but sometimes they want the advantage of these advanced features that come with this stuff. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think the cloud providers are starting to become comfortable with what that partnership model looks like. Customers like it because they want to be in an AWS or an Azure or a Google or whatever cloud, and be able to get the services and the applications that they want. So I think we're going to see that as a very growing and accelerating trend over time. And then the last one that is an interesting trend, and I don't know exactly how to kind of classify this one, but we're seeing more and more of, we've sort of seeing the end of infrastructure, if you will. And I know that sounds like a weird thing, but I don't think we're going to continue to see nearly as many sort of infrastructure-centric open source projects that then could be picked up and delivered as services out of the public cloud. But we are seeing more and more data services. And obviously, that makes a lot of sense. People are generating more data. They're relying more on data. They're looking for AI and ML to help them with that. And so we're seeing this interesting trend of more and more data level OSS projects that then have to figure out what is their place in the world in terms of commercialization, in terms of becoming native services in the public cloud, in terms of becoming cloud first. And so, I think we're sort of, seeing the end of we've seen Linux, we've seen Kubernetes, we've seen some things in the open source space that sort of redefined what infrastructure looks like. I think we're going to see less and less of that. We'll see more and more of sort of data-centric ones. And the trick with the data-centric ones is they tend to be, sort of almost vendor specific in that they're dominated by, oftentimes a single vendor. And the community doesn't really break out of that. You don't see, 10 people like we do, 10 companies like we do with Kubernetes, or 10 like we see with Linux or something. So that's going to be an interesting trend to sort of watch. All right, let me get to the the unknown parts, what I'll sort of classify as unknowns. The first one is acquisitions. And, if we look back at the trajectory of how other parts of our industry have worked, usually when a company gets to a certain size, they get into billions and billions of dollars of revenue. Their shareholders, their stakeholders, even their customers expect them to make big bets. They don't want to see hundreds and hundreds and dozens of little tiny $5 million projects and $10 million projects here and there. They need the next $1 billion. They need the next $2, $3, $4 billion. And so this is oftentimes where we see them start to make big bet acquisitions. And we haven't really seen the big cloud providers do this yet. I mean, we've seen them make smaller acquisitions here and there. They tended to avoid them because it was just such a big cultural change. But it will be interesting as we start to see more and more companies begin life as being sort of cloud first, cloud native companies. Do they start to get acquired, right? So the acquisition model here is still very, very unknown. The cloud providers have sort of said, hey, that's not really our thing. But, at some point, as people are talking about, well, their growth rates are slowing down or whatever, will we see them start to make some huge acquisitions? And does that market first have to have a set of big cloud native first companies there available for them to kind of get acquired? So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. The next is obviously, changes in leadership can have huge impacts on companies. And, right now, I think we're in a relatively stable place in terms of the big three or four. AWS is probably the most unknown at this very moment in time. Obviously, with Andy Jassy leaving, it's unknown who's going to take over. But you tend to believe that they've got a deep bench that one will transition pretty well. But that one's still got some level of unknownness to it. Microsoft seems to be fairly stable. Scott Guthrie, Satya Nadella, Mark Ruskovich, and that crew over at AWS or at Azure tends to be fairly stable right now. And then Google seems to have sort of settled into the Thomas Kurian era. They're becoming who they're becoming. It seems like they're growing, even though, they're still in third place, but they seem to be growing. But, over 3, 4, 5 years, leadership changes can always have a huge impact. So that's always something to keep an eye on and to see, does that really change any big philosophies of what's going on? The next thing I had on our list, and we've got 2 more things we're going to hit to, and then we'll kind of close off this show. The next one we really haven't seen is any major pricing wars, right? If you think back 6-7 years, right, we always heard about AWS talking about, hey, we're constantly doing price changes. But we really haven't seen, now that they have significant competition from Azure and from Google and from Alibaba and some others, really, really significant sort of price wars, right? And we've seen this in every other major industry at some point. Somebody wants to take market share. They're willing to significantly change the pricing game to take on, short-term customers in order to, in order to take market share and then, sort of get rid of their competition. This is going to be harder and harder to do. I think, they all have very, very deep pockets. They all have other businesses that they can use to prop up these businesses. So I don't know if we'll necessarily see that, but that's definitely an element of this game that we definitely have not seen per se, at least when they were of, relatively similar sizes, right? Like I said, AWS made their name early on for doing a lot of price cuts, but we haven't seen sort of pricing wars as we've seen in other industries. And then finally, I think the last thing that becomes a big unknown in this is are there other big emerging players, right? We always talk about the big three. We've seen IBM and Oracle and kind of companies from previous eras not necessarily be able to succeed and expand out into the cloud era. But do we see an Alibaba becoming bigger than sort of a regional player? Obviously, if you can dominate in Asia, Asia's a humongous market. But do we see them expanding into Europe? Do we see them expanding in the United States more than they do today? Somebody like Apple come along, right? We've seen Apple, curiously hiring a lot of engineering talent recently, sort of small groups, but they have huge ambitions to do more than just sell phones. They want to get into healthcare. They want to get into various aspects of, speculation on autonomous driving and so forth. So, do they become a much more vertically integrated cloud and tap into, a big segment of what the other cloud providers were trying to get into? So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I've been going for quite a while here. So we really kind of wanted to take this one and look at what are the things we feel really confident in. What are the things that we expect are going to be big change areas that are still to be determined? And then what are the big unknowns? So hopefully, this gives you some things to think about as to, how the next 3 years, 5 years, maybe beyond that will evolve here in the cloud space. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. As always, thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for rating the show on iTunes. And we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.